I want to talk briefly today about something that will arise in most classes in schools and with adult groups as well, namely a very simple question. It is clear that the Holocaust was a form of genocide. I don't think one has to prove that. But there are other genocides that happened in the last 100 or 200 years. So why don't we teach about Rwanda or Darfur today, or the Armenian genocide in the First World War, or other events of that kind in the past, and why do we concentrate on the genocide of the Jews, which is what the Holocaust is? The term Holocaust simply is a special term that people use. I don't usually use it, but I will this time. It means the genocide of the Jewish people at the hand of Nazi Germany and its allies and supporters. Now, in order to examine what the specifics are of the genocide of the Jews, I think one has to first of all try to understand what genocide is. Now, you all know, I'm sure, that in December 1948, the United Nations General Assembly passed unanimously the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And most countries in the world by now have signed this convention. The convention is the product, in large part, of one person, a Polish-Jewish lawyer by the name of Raphael Lemkin, Lemkin, who managed to escape to the United States from Poland via Sweden in 1941. And a few years later he was already a professor at Columbia and so on, a very unusual person who already in 1933 submitted a paper to a conference of international lawyers in Madrid. He was not permitted to go there, but he submitted a paper in which he asked for an international law to prevent and punish the ultimate crime of annihilating groups of people. He did not then invent the term genocide. This happened most likely in 1943 when he was in the United States. And he used the term for the first time in 1944 in a book that I think people should read, and that is Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. It was published at that time in the United States. And then he convinced the State Department to support a law like that. And this was put on the international agenda. And after negotiations between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc in 1948, but with very active participation of Latin American countries, a compromise was achieved, which is the result is the Genocide Convention. Now, the Genocide Convention is not exactly what Raphael Lemkin proposed. It's a political document. It is not a document that was drawn up by academics. It is inaccurate and in many ways misleading. But that's what we have. Why do I say that it is inaccurate and misleading? It says that genocide is the intent and action to annihilate an ethnic, national, racial, and or religious group as such, in whole or in part. Now, ethnic, national, racial, and religion, on the face of it, seems logical. But what do racial groups mean? There are no races. We know today from DNA research that all of us, whether we are Australian Aborigines or Africans in Sudan, or Einstein, Hitler, Stalin, Mr. Obama, or you and I, we all come from the same place, namely East Africa, about 150,000 years ago. We are all one race. The difference between different types of dogs is much larger than the difference between different types of humans. The color of skin, of hair, of eyes, the shape of bodies, those are secondary or tertiary mutations, very unimportant. An Australian Aborigine can marry an Inuit, an Eskimo in Alaska and produce healthy children. We are one race. Now in 1948, to talk about racial groups made sense because everybody who used that term. Churchill talked about the German race and the English race, and indeed the Jewish race and the American race, whatever that means. And this was the common language that was used. But in 2010, it is very dangerous to talk about in that kind of language, because it could indicate racism, because there are no races, but there is racism. And racism is a product of the late Middle Ages in Africa, and then taken up by the Iberian Peninsula, by Spanish and Portuguese invaders of Africa, first North Africa and then Western Africa. It is a product of the slave trade, which preceded the European conquest of West Africa. In the late Middle Ages, slaves were enslaved by Africans. Africans enslaved other Africans and then sold them to Arab traders who traded them to other African countries, and later to the whites who occupied the harbors of West Africa. And from there, then millions upon millions of people were shipped on terrible ships to the American continent, North, Mid-America and North America. And millions died, and others who survived were enslaved for hundreds of years. And in order to justify that, to rationalize that, the natural thing was to take the obvious difference in the color of skin. Now, the people who traded in slaves were not only whites. There were Arabs, Jews, there were other Europeans, there were also Africans who were slave traders. But the vast majority were Iberian whites. This is the origin of racism. And if you look at Gothic churches on the European continent that were built between the 12th and the 14th centuries, you will find in almost all of them the sculpture of an African saint, Saint Mauritius. If you look at the features of that saint in stone, you will find typical African features. There was no racism in Europe before the 14th century. And so this is a new development, and a very dangerous development. And to include that in a definition of genocide, I think, is already out of place in 2010. But it's not only that. The crucial element in the convention is the fact that it doesn't tell you what to do if somebody recognizes something to be a genocide. Because all it says there is, go to the United Nations, which means in fact go to the Security Council, which is the executive committee of the United Nations. It's the only body that can make decisions on action. Now, if you go to the Security Council, as people did in the past, well, good luck. Nothing happens. Why? Because there are 5 veto powers, because there are groups of nations that try to prevent the prevention because it's against their interests, and there is very little possibility of acting. The only time the United Nations can act is when there is an agreement by all the major actors that something should be prevented.